All right. So thanks everyone. So typical of every Salesforce presentation, I'm showing you the forward-looking statement, but I'm not going to be speaking about any products. But then a lot of the content that I'm going to share is of my personal this thing, and is not affiliated with Salesforce in any ways. Next is I want to thank the sponsors. I think a lot of work has gone into putting together this. A lot of companies have helped pull together this entire event. I know personally that a lot of the sponsors that reached out way back in January and February. A lot of work has gone into pulling together this content. And a huge shout out to these, to the organizers, Abhinav, Amit, Jitendra. A lot of you have put in a lot of hours, but so thank you once again. By way of introduction, I'm a chief customer technology advisor at Salesforce. Pretty close to like 2 decades of experience, of which 6 years in the running with Salesforce, and about 10 years with Accenture. And it was at Accenture that that I got introduced to the Salesforce ecosystem. So I've been there since 2009. I've been working on the platform. A little bit about my role. Recently moved into this role after spending about 5 to 6 years with the customer service organization, where I was doing implementation as an architect. Here in this role, I guide our most strategic customers and prospects, pretty large customers in the India region, on their digital transformation journey, as they try to move on into the digital transformation world to meet the demands of the new world, which is the COVID as well as the fourth industrial revolution. I've got the certified technical architect certification around 2004, 4 years ago, so May 2016. Actually, this month is the fourth anniversary of getting this certification. Feels like just yesterday that I just went through all of those materials and attended the review board. But everything is quite clear in my mind on how the journey was. So I wanted to take a little bit through the journey along with you, and focus on some parts of that journey. 20 minutes is what has been given to me, and I wanted to pick up an area of that journey, which is something that I can address in 20 minutes as a complete, wholesome part, and hopefully you can take some tips out of it. But before I get onto the journey, this is something that I always share. So I want to sort of share the characteristics of an architect, so that it's important for you to know the whole part before you start working on the individual components to it. And you would have seen this in almost all of my presentations to the community. I shared with this very importantly, because I think this sums up everything that an architect is within the Salesforce ecosystem, and especially around a CTA. He or she is someone who understands a broad knowledge of the different parts of the Salesforce ecosystem. If you have experience in multiple development platforms, that is great. But then it's not a necessity. But it's important that you understand the various products of Salesforce and how you can actually bring it all together to actually solve a problem. CTA is the pinnacle of certifications. There's approximately around 300 certified Salesforce architects in the world, and it's very hard to actually find an architect in the ecosystem. If you look at the job ratio, it's like 4 to 1. When it compares to developers. One of the things that I always try and amplify is you should be aware of who the mascot is. I know that all of you know the Appy and Cody. They are very popular, thanks to Dreamforce. But Ruth was introduced in 2018 to represent the architects, and a lot of the characteristics of an elephant really is what an architect is. I very jokingly share this with my other team members. It's not about the size, but it is about the qualities. An elephant is someone who always leads the herd, someone who has a very, very sharp knowledge, who remembers quite a lot of things. They have one of the strongest memories. So a lot of that personifies, what an architect is. The architect journey, you would have seen this slide quite a bit, in this whole, not only in this presentation as well as in other, conferences as well. You start out with specializations where you like focus on the domains, and then you pick up the either the domain architect depending upon where you are currently and you aspire to be, and then finally you move on to the pinnacle of all certifications. So I wanted to break this whole journey right, into a few parts that you can actually consume, and depending upon where you are, some of these things would resonate to you. The number one, and you would have seen in the previous triangle as well, that we always harp on the concept of building your foundations like really really solid. You got to go like really really deep into your domains, and sometimes often the questions that comes to me when I meet with community members is like, how deep should we actually go into some of these things, right? The simple answer that I have, or at least in my personal journey when I went through it, let's say if you pick up integration as a topic, I would read pretty much every blog that is out there that is on integrations. And most importantly, it is not just integrations from a perspective of Salesforce. How does Google do it? How would you do it on Azure? How would you do it on AWS? What are some of those like intricacies that we need to be aware? So not just the patterns, but just go a little bit deeper down. Okay, like how does an external gateway work? How does an internal gateway? How do we set up like firewalls? What are some of the things like forward proxy and reverse proxy? What do they actually mean, right? And sort of like relate to it. And over that time, you would actually come up with a lot of notes, right? I wanted to share some of my notes, on the presentation today. I used Evernote where I documented everything, a whole bunch of links, and if some of you who are senior and who probably will be like traveling quite a bit, I've actually captured, downloaded copies of blog articles that I can actually read on an airplane, or when you're like sitting and waiting for your customer to come in, right? So this period is really really important, and I couldn't stress a lot anymore on this one, because it's very very important for you to get your foundation really really right, because when you're actually given that scenario to present in the review board, things needs to come to you like a muscle memory, right? You do not have the time to actually go through your decision tree to like figure out which of the components that I need to use, but it needs to come to you immediately. So this example that I'm showing you here is about application design, sharing and security. That was actually my most favorite topic that I spent quite a bit of time. In fact, I think when me and my colleague Praful Chaudhary, when we both went to a review board, I think we probably in our entire foundation journey we would have spent about 1.5 to 2 months just on sharing and security, just hashing the daylight out of it. We would spin up like multiple developer edition orgs to really like troubleshoot that one. And then comes the whole presentation skills. Now, this is something that over my last 4 years, I've coached a lot of people internally, and more often than not, I think we get really good at understanding the concepts, the foundation, but we struggle to put that forward to an audience who can actually consume that in a short span of time. Right, so I think presentation skills is extremely important, and obviously go ahead and practice the scenario so that you get the hang of it, and then you attend the review board. So when these the organizers, when they reached out to me, and when I had 20 minutes in me, what I was really thinking is like, what's the right place to actually use that time? And I thought presentation skills is very very important, because and as you go through the slides, you'll understand why it is. Because the foundations, you can actually look at Trailhead, you can look at Salesforce Help, YouTube videos, a lot of the blogs of the other CTAs to get deep into the domain. But the soft skill is something that's like very, very difficult to learn unless you actually practice it. So if you look at the presentation, right, the review board, you're given a scenario. The scenario is usually about 5 to 6 pages long, and you have 3 hours for the scenario review and solution presentation. And then you get 45 minutes to present that. So think of it, right? 3 hours, you got a 5 to 8 page document. 3 hours is what you actually got to read it and understand it. And 45 minutes to actually present that whole scenario end to end with the solution on the Salesforce ecosystem. right? That's why I think it's very, very important that you get your presentation skills right. And why I thought that this 20 minutes would be best spent on giving you a framework or a guideline to help you out with that. So let's start with what are the different parts of it. And before I get there, I want you to understand the reason why I'm actually talking about this. So if you look at the exam guide, right, this is a typical exam guide for a CTA. You have they've broken down based on the different sections and what do they actually look for it. And one particular thing that I want to point out to you, notice this word trade-offs there. Right? You'll be surprised to know the number of times the word trade-offs have actually been used in the exam guide. It could be used in like trade-offs, justifications, those are all various terminologies. But notice how the exam guide tells you over and over again that you got to justify why you have actually picked up a solution. So understand how the board focuses not just on how you solved it, but why you actually solved it, right? And that's what we're gonna uncover in the next 10 minutes. So I thought I'll give you a bit of a framework on how I've actually done that, on how I coach my my team members when they actually go to the review board. So I always tell them that when you actually articulate something, you got to start out with this framework, which is okay, for this particular requirement, I plan to use this because of here is all the reasons why I think I'm proposing this particular solution. Okay? That's the framework that if you can actually practice your scenarios, your responses in this kind of a constraint, what this helps is for the judges to understand that you are not just solving a solution, but you've actually considered various trade-offs and factors and constraints and limits for you to come up with this particular solution. So let's take an example of it, right? I've picked up the one that is publicly available, which is the city scooter share. And I wanted to touch upon the actors and licenses part of it. I thought I'll use that as an example to hone in this particular point. On the left-hand side is a screenshot of the scenario, which talks about the different actors that are there. And we're going to pick up first the CSS rider support representatives. So here the license that I've proposed is Salesforce Cloud, and the justification is, while they need access to cases, I do not see any requirements for entitlements in that entire scenario. So this is the reason why I'm proposing a Sales Cloud instead of Service Cloud. So you notice how, for a particular requirement, I've proposed the solution and also justified as to why I picked up Sales Cloud instead of Service Cloud. Okay. Another example, CSS Regional Maintenance Associate. That's the second persona. So here I'm proposing Sales Cloud again, because part of their role is all about selling and partner management. And having cases is important for a true 360-degree view. Hence, I'm proposing Sales Cloud license. And because there's no requirements for entitlements, I'm not suggesting Service Cloud here. Right? Another example that I wanted to do was for the external users. So here, registered riders, I'm proposing customer community license because for one, these are external users, right? And there's about 100,000 of them. So, I have considered volume in mind. And because they need access to check out and check in their scooter, they require like basic sharing capabilities. There's no complex sharing, so which is why I'm not proposing customer community plus, but instead giving them customer community. So you notice how in all of these articulation, you probably would have felt, what is the reason why I gave them a certain license and not some other license, right? So this is why I keep reiterating the fact that you got to include justification as part of the way you articulate the solution. Let's take another example, integration requirements. I think this is something that's often seen, and it's a little bit more detailed when you actually articulate that. So in this particular scenario, as part of the scooter ride registration, they would like to validate the driver's license in real time. Okay, so that's the integration requirement, and the way I would go about it is I would explain it in my presentation is like City Scooter Share is a global company with presence across different countries, right? So validating a driver's license means we have to keep in mind different countries, different systems, and different response times. So since the requirement is for real-time validation, I'm proposing that we use remote process invocation, request and reply integration pattern. And an ESD is very, very important for this integration, as the middleware will orchestrate the calls to different country based on the API, the request that they're getting from Salesforce. Because we do not have control on the different countries' APIs and response time, I propose we use continuation so that this request does not factor under the long-running governor limit. So you notice how, for a particular, just a one line of requirement, you got to articulate first what are some of the things that you're keeping in mind. So what are some of those um, constraints or the untold requirements in this one line in terms of different countries and the different response time and different systems, the different request and response structures, how you're keeping that in mind and then coming to a solution and explaining the parts of the solution, why it is really, really important. And not just that, but to actually go ahead and give a perspective on what you are actually thinking in terms of the governor limits and what are some of these other parts of the requirement to make that whole integration requirement complete. Okay, so hopefully that the one thing that I want you to actually take away from this presentation is when you actually presenting your solution, right, you got to speak about it from a whole perspective and not just pointed solution. The things that I've often heard when I coach my own mentees is they would read this requirement saying CSS would like to verify the validity. So for this, I'll be using a request and reply, a real-time integration pattern. And then they would move on to the next one. And I'm like, yeah, that is obvious because there's a word called as real time. So obviously it is request and reply. But why that? Like, why are you actually picking up that particular integration pattern? And if you're picking that up, how are you keeping in mind the entire Salesforce solution in terms of governor limits? How are you addressing the different country-wide driver's license APIs? So that's the thing that I often look for when I coach my mentees in this. It's not about the how, right? But it's about like how, why you actually picked up that requirement. Yeah. In summary, justification is extremely important. I mean, you saw in the previous exam guide how the word trade-offs and justification, constraints and lists is like repeatedly iterated there. There is a reason why it is actually there, right? And oftentimes, when I give this feedback to the people that I'm coaching, the myth that they actually have is, if I actually start to explain each requirement solution in detail, then I'm never going to finish in time. And I tell them, like, listen, you have an example in front of you. This is how, people like Praful, Ritika, Jay, Rohit, all of the people who have passed the review board, in the last few years, they've actually done this, And the only way that you can actually do it is like you got to practice it. You got to practice it and keep it under 30 seconds, so that you can actually cover your entire scenario in time. But one of the things that you should remember, right, as judges, when we sit on the review board, what we're looking for is, are you really an architect from a perspective of understanding the entire landscape and understanding the customer requirements really, really before articulating a solution, and not just how you actually go about doing it. Right? Use the same framework for Q&A as well. Because it's helpful for the judges to actually get that feeling from what you're actually explaining. Right? So hopefully, I know it was a very short 20 minutes, and I thought presentation being one of those areas which is very, very difficult, and it's a soft skill that needs to be practiced. Hopefully, I've given you a framework that you can actually look at. Please continue practicing it with your scenarios with your peers, and wish you all the best in your CTA journey. That pretty much brings me to the end of the presentation.